Welcome, everyone, to the Mind of Christ here on YouTube. My name is Justin Amos, and I am so excited to be joined today by my friend Brendan McGinnis. Brendan is a detective with the St. Joseph, Missouri Police Department, and today we're going to be discussing mental health and just the impact that mental illness can have in a community. So, Brendan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
You bet. Well, Brendan, why don't we start off by having you share just a little bit about yourself, your family, how long you've been in law enforcement, and just anything else that you'd like our viewers to know about you.
So I'm born and raised St. Joe. Graduated from Central High School, a little time at Missouri Western. I was actually in the military before becoming a police officer. Was stationed at Fort Bragg doing military police and criminal investigations for about 4 years. I moved back to St. Joe, got hired on with the St. Joseph Police Department in 2006, and I've been there now for going on 19 years. Worked my way through the department, and I'm currently a detective in the detective division. I handle electronic crimes, so I deal with video, cell phone, computers in relation to any crime, and I'm also the Northwest Missouri Fraternal Order of Police president for our union and fraternal order. Married to Ashley McGinnis, who is going to be the superintendent of the school district. And we have a son, Kian, who's 17. And that's pretty much my story.
Yeah,
We're
awesome.
here.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Brendan, my first question is, what is it like being an officer in St. Joseph, and what impact do you see that mental health has in the community that you serve?
Well, throughout my career and even in the military, I can say that mental health has definitely become a subject that's more prevalent in both in law enforcement and just in general. I can remember 19 years ago starting at the police department, and we definitely dealt with mental health different than we deal with mental health now. I think back in the day, back 19 years ago, our go-to was not necessarily any sort of intervention or understanding. It was more just a take them to get treatment, and we really didn't take the time to learn someone's story or what issues or problems they were facing in their life. We do see a lot of it in St. Joseph. I often say people don't call us when they're having a good day. So whether that just be a generalized crime, whether that be a mental health episode, whether that be anything from homicide to your garden gnome was stolen. People don't call us and ask us to show up and so they can tell us how great their day was. So we see people usually 99% of the time when they're at their lowest.
From 2006 to now, how have you seen the increase in mental health problems arising, or just more awareness of it, or what has that been like in your unique position?
Well, I can remember, when I first started, cell phones didn't have free nights or weekends, and you were on a minute plan. So originally when I started, if we need to call into dispatch, we would stop at a gas station where they had pay phones, and those were those things you put quarters in. For people who don't know, I think it ended up being 35 cents at one point before they got rid of them. So the mental health side was more of people hit it. They really didn't speak out about it. Looking back, we probably missed quite a few mental health issues that we labeled as something else. A domestic, for instance, between a husband and a wife, or a parent and a kid. There was probably mental health issues involved there, and we would chalk it up as a kid being a kid. Not only that, but I mean, juvenile mental health, I feel like has exponentially grown. And I wouldn't know why. I have my own personal belief as why, and that goes back to cell phones and technology at your fingertips. But we would look at a kid as ungovernable, which is what we labeled them as, or what the state would call that. And that was anyone under the legal age of adult that failed to follow their parents' guidance, rules, laws. Mom said be home at 10. You show up at home at 11. You get in a fight with mom. We called that ungovernable. Is what the state and what the law determined that as. So there's a lot of ungovernable juveniles. Looking back, hindsight always being 2020, it was probably mental health issues then, but even 10 years ago, mental health came with a stigma. You didn't want to be labeled. So we aren't immune to the same thing that society was feeling. If anything, we helped perpetuate the problem because it was easier just to lock people up than get them treatment or help.
Yeah. Yeah. What percentage of crimes, if you had to guess, that happen in this community are related to untreated mental illness? Just kind of a ballpark figure, like what you see most days, most weeks.
I will say it ebbs and flows. 19 years, I can pretty much predict that October to February are rough months for mental health issues. Probably 50% in general. There's some sort of mental health crisis going on there. And when I say mental health, I'm including alcohol and drugs into that crisis. Probably every bit of 50% of the calls we get. Actual crimes committed, probably 75% or more. Whether that be stealing for drugs, stealing for, whatever, or, crimes that the underlying issue is mental health. October through February are rough. That's usually when our suicides go up. I attribute that to the holiday time, lack of family, lack of support. It's colder. You aren't outside interacting with people as much. You're able to kind of isolate yourself in your home, which I think was a big part of COVID. And I'm sure I've read the articles and seen the news, that COVID exponentially grew mental health because it forced people to isolate. And I feel like, and even you all have preached at church, isolation isn't a good thing. And I feel that a lot of that is when the devil and mental health really came to the surface. So 2022 was kind of the peak. We had kind of had some programs we started to put in place at the police department, but it became real apparent and evident during those times that we need to not only take a policing aspect, but take that a step further because, like I said, we're just perpetuating the problem. Jail doesn't solve a mental health crisis.
Yeah.
It just sometimes can make it worse.
Yeah.
So we've kind of, statistically speaking, it's 50%. We probably get, even outside of those months, probably, I would guess 1 to 2 suicidal calls a day in the community.
Wow.
Understanding that some of those are just to reach out for help, and some of them may be legit. I can say that usually the ones who reach out for help want help. The ones that no one hears or knows what's going on, those are usually the ones that follow through with the action. But when we investigate those, there was red flags. People just weren't aware of the red flags that they were exhibiting.
Yeah. So you're saying 1 to 2 times a day, you guys will get a kind of a suicide crisis call. In general, about 50% of the problems you encounter are related to mental health, mental illness in some way, and then 75% of actual crimes committed, you would say, are attributed to untreated mental illness in some form.
Yes.
Wow. And how does a police department try to address that or navigate that, knowing you guys are not mental health professionals? Yeah, I mean, how do you tackle that? Those are huge numbers.
So and I don't know the exact year, we integrated what's called a CIT program, which is a crisis intervention team. So we do have officers that are specially trained in mental health, not to the counselor level or um, in the actual fix the problem level, but they understand enough about the diseases that are going on that they're able to better relate or deal with the problem um, that person may be having at that time. And then we also and we're currently in the process of adding an embedded social worker. So a lot of times, if it's someone who calls us and says, "Hey, I'm suicidal," but then we show up and they don't answer the door, we will send an email to the social worker, and the social worker can go out and follow up and kind of try to provide and start that care, whether that be get them to family guidance or get them to Mosaic or because there is that threat or stigma that we show up. Um, it almost feels backwards, you know. We're forcing people to get help, and usually when you force someone to do something, it usually doesn't last. They have to do it on their own free will. They have to want to get help, and in order to do that, and a lot of times we have people that sometimes they just need the medication. You know, they've abused it, they've sold it, they've um, so at that point we would just take them to Mosaic, and then they keep track of whether or not this person's been in multiple times for lack of medication, and then we let the doctors determine kind of the correct appropriate action on that.
Yeah. Brendan, what would you say from your perspective are some of the hurdles that you've seen that just prevent people, organizations, even churches, just to take mental health seriously? I mean, you've mentioned stigma a few times here and there. Like, is there anything else you would add that you just see as just roadblocks for people, organizations, churches to take this crisis seriously?
I think from my perspective, um, even at the police department, and in life in general, people, it's a win or fail, you win or lose situation. Everybody wants to check the win box. In life, sometimes you lose. But I think in the mental health field, you can't really check the win or loss box, you know, because um, you're trying to check the box based off a human who you can't control, who you can't force really to do anything. So the lack of control and ability to control the situation makes organizations, even churches. No church wants to say, "Hey, 75% of our population has mental health issues, and next year you have 85%." I mean, to most organizations that would be a fail. You know, um, so I think it's just the messiness of it. That there's no clear cut answers. I'm very black and white. I like, the law states this, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I follow the law, you follow the law, and if you don't, this is the consequence. With mental health, it's not that way. And, you know, then you start playing into with the side effects of medication, so is the mental health being treated by medication, but now are you having side effects from the medication? Because not everyone reacts the same way to the side effects of the medication. And, I've dealt with people on lithium before, which, dealing in that, I mean, that's, they use that in batteries, and so we're putting something we put in batteries into a human body. And in my mind, that it can't be great, but I think at that state and point that there's no other option. So when you deal with those type of people, are you seeing the side effects of the lithium, or are they actually having a mental health crisis? So I think organizations, churches, they struggle to figure out because there's no end goal. There's no finish line with mental health counseling or mental health disease. It's an ever changing world, and there's no completeness or job complete that most organizations strive for.
Yeah. Oh, you bring up, that's such a good point. It just makes me think of how, like you said, messy and just how complex mental health is. And there is, there are some illnesses, physical illnesses, that's just, hey, do this and you'll be better. It's not necessarily that way with
Right.
mental health, right? It's not, hey, take this medicine and you're good. That could work. It might not work at all.
Right.
I always try to tell people, and kind of what I, promote is just, it's got to be a holistic endeavor. For the majority of the population, it could be medication, but like you mentioned earlier, we cannot be in isolation. I mean, isolation will just destroy you and fill you, right, with depression, shame, whatever it might be. We have to have a strong community. We have to have a couple trusted people we can turn to. Faith can play a huge part for a lot of people in healing and instilling hope, and then, just self-education is a big part too. Like, if you do get a diagnosis, or if you know somebody that has some training in mental health, get their insight and try to educate yourself. Maybe read on trauma, read some books on anxiety and depression. It's not just a easy fix.
Right.
It's a holistic pursuit, and so that makes sense. It probably just feels way too overwhelming, and it's just like, we'll focus our attention somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that totally makes sense.
And it's easy for me to sit here and say this because it's easy for me to fix everybody else's problems. But I think everybody's experienced some sort of mental health, I won't even say crisis, challenge in their life, whether personally or with a family member. And until you fully understand it, I'll be the first to admit, many years ago, and probably 10 years ago, to me, if you didn't want to think that way, stop thinking it. And that was how you fix mental health. That's how you fix the problem. If you don't want to have those thoughts, just don't think them. And so in my mind, it was that easy, until you really experience it, and then when you see it, and you realize that it's not that easy. You can't just flip the switch, and they aren't choosing to flip that switch. So there's a lot of compassion, and understanding that has to take place. And not everybody deals with the same thing the same way.
Yeah.
And in our profession, like I said, we see the worst of the worst. We see the gruesome of the gruesome. No one likes going to kid stuff, whether that be kid homicides or kid deaths or anything like that. That affects everybody. We just try to keep it non-relatable, I think, which is the best way, kind of immune ourselves from the situation we're dealing in. But we have seen a uptick in mental health retirements, and mental health issues. And like any place, like why we're discussing this, we're probably 20 years behind the power curve on dealing with mental health, within the organization and within policing in general. The state of Missouri just enacted a law not too long ago, that now every 5 years we have to have a mental health evaluation. We do as officers to maintain our license. And the first year is kind of a baseline type deal. And I would assume that's probably the state saw a high number of law enforcement officers that were probably having mental health issues. So, and the reality, you can't have someone that is severely broken, because I think we're all broken in some way or another, out trying to solve someone else's problems. Because at the end of the day, they give me a gun, and they don't tell me when to use it, and they don't tell me when to use my handcuffs. And if you aren't right mentally, you could do a lot of damage, in my profession. So it's probably long overdue, and we're just now starting to have these discussions within our department, and as a profession in whole. So
Yeah. You said something a little bit ago that I think is just so critical. You said the word compassion. We have to have that compassionate curiosity. Like, if really to any loved one in your life, but just not assuming that what somebody's going through. Like, everybody is fighting their own demons. We just can't see it.
Yep.
And so if we can operate from a posture of just compassionate curiosity, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? And be willing to listen rather than try to fix, that alone would solve a lot of problems, letting people feel seen, heard, and valued. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And it's encouraging, too, to hear just some steps that the state of Missouri is taking on making sure officers are doing well. Yeah, it's hard to care for others when you're drowning yourself.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Um, Brendan, can you give our viewers a glimpse into just a little bit of maybe what the training looks like for officers to step into a mental health crisis situation? So if someone is having, let's say, a manic episode and maybe they're actively committing a crime and it is clear, you know what's going on, right? They're not in the right state of mind. What do you do in that situation? What's the protocol? Can you give us a little bit of just what that's like from your perspective when you get called to just severe crisis situations like that?
Yep. Usually, um, I will say it does bear a lot of weight, and a lot of pressure. Although a judge and a jury usually determine the mental competency on whether or not the crime was committed. That all sounds great in theory, right? That, if someone feels like they were having a mental health episode, why this crime is being committed, they'll go see a psychologist. In theory, that's the way the law reads. That's the way it works. It all sounds great. But when we show up, we're tasked with making those same decisions right at that moment. So we go through a CIT course, the Crisis Intervention Team course. Just a pretty basic course of, hey, this is what narcissism looks like. This is what depression looks like. This is what anxiety looks like. This is what schizophrenia looks like. And kind of just some do's and don'ts of each one of those. But the resounding underlying factor there is kind of what we've talked about, just compassion and treating someone as a human. And not as a criminal. And we treat people like criminals, just like, we're mean to our brothers and sisters. And we've really taken this approach of let's look at the person and why they committed the crime rather than why they are committing the crime. And so if it is a mental health episode, a lot of times we see that in domestic type situations. Is it really a fight between a brother, sister, mom, dad, husband, wife, or is this a mental health episode? So based on our determining factors then, and a lot of times there's clues, if you see medication sitting around, or most people that have been truly diagnosed will tell you what is going on with them, or a family member will say, hey, they've been diagnosed as such and such. And so at that point, we determine whether or not we feel that they need to go to jail for the crime that may or may not have been committed, or they need to seek medical help. So we have the power by the state of Missouri, us and doctors, to put someone on what's called a 96-hour hold. And at that point, if we determine it's a mental health, we can take you to any medical institution in the state of Missouri, sign an affidavit, and they should keep you 96 hours in a mental health ward where you will be seen by a counselor, a psychologist, an ER doctor, to kind of try to right whatever is going wrong at that point. We try to use that limited because it is very touchy. We're basically stripping you of your rights. We're holding you no matter what your will is, and we're forcing you to seek help. That usually isn't a good solution, but in extreme cases, we don't have a choice. And I would rather take someone to Mosaic than see them hurt themselves or someone else. So we try to use it sparingly. I will say, when I started in 06, we'd maybe do one a week. We're probably 5 to 10 a week now. So it's grown exponentially.
Wow. Yeah. I love something you said a little bit ago. That was just so kind. Just, when you get those calls that, it's just horrible and heartbreaking to try to view each person you work with through the lens of this is a human being who's hurting.
Yes.
rather than, oh, this is an awful criminal. Like
Yep.
that's just such a kind and compassionate posture to take. So yeah, I just love hearing that from an officer. So thank you for that.
No.
Yeah, kind of compassion. Um, so kind of a personal question here, Brendan. How do you just keep your own mental health, in a good spot when you see violence and addiction and crimes every single day? Like you said, you see the worst of the worst. So for you, what does that look like to take your own mental health seriously?
Well, luckily, I do have a good support system with my wife, who also has a background in mental health counseling um, before she got into education. Um, but I truly believe, for me personally, that, and I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago, probably even, that God put me in this position, so he protects me in this position. Um, I can't say that I don't know, or I can't remember certain things. I can remember every kid death. I can tell you where it was at, what the weather was, their names, which those are the tough ones, because they're innocent. Adults make decisions. They choose. A kid usually doesn't choose um, what's happened to them. But I would say my main source in maintaining my mental health is I try to stay right with God. Um, and I can honestly say I never had any mental health issues, but I think we all have at some point, no matter how big or how small. But I just continually believe and trust that God put me in this position, whether it be the president of the FOP or as a law enforcement officer. And he stays true to his word that he will provide everything. And whether that be, mental health sovereignty, whether that be healing, whatever that need is, he will provide it. And so, um, I try to just stay focused on him, and let him guide me, into whatever area or arena I feel is the way I need to go with stuff. So,
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
yeah.
So kind of my last question, what encouragement would you give our viewers watching on why they should take mental health seriously? So kind of another way to look at it is what's at stake? Like, why must we as a society take mental health seriously?
Because I would say it's one of the most prevalent issues facing us as a community, as a nation. Um, and I think you might know more than me, but statistically speaking, because I feel like almost all of it can be treatable to some extent. And I say treatable, not that you'll ever be cured from it or fixed from it, but it's manageable, I guess, is a better term for it. Um, and I think a lot of it goes unnoticed because we don't want to see it. And like we talked earlier, it's messy, and it gets messy, especially um, within a home, and I'm glad that Wellspring is taking the role that it has, because I grew up in RLDS church, and mental health definitely was not talked about. If you didn't talk about mental health in the church, God provided everything. There's no such thing as mental health. If um, So I'm glad that the church and other organizations are kind of stepping into that gap where I know God exists and He provides, um, but we're humans and we're flawed.
Mm.
And I think that it's good for churches and people just to step into that space. And if everyone was a little more aware of those flags, I do believe it's just like cancer. The sooner you can catch it, um, the better the outcome is going to be on it, So um, I would say that when people are showing behaviors that aren't normal, or prevalent that you've seen on a regular basis, it's probably time to start reaching out to someone or become curious as to what's going on. Um, it's they're tough conversations to have, but I firmly believe that 90% of people just want to be heard.
Mm.
And if you just hear people out, most of the fight and the battle never even occurs. They just want to say what they need to say, or they need to vent or tell you what the problem is. And it's almost like a self-awareness thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. That makes me think that people don't want to be fixed. People just want to know that they're not alone.
Yes.
The only thing worse than suffering is suffering alone. So absolutely agree with you on that one. So, well, Brendan, thank you so much for this conversation and for joining me today. I hope, this has just given our viewers just a glimpse on what a detective, a law enforcement officer sees on a given day, a given week in a community, and just how of a major impact mental health is. This is not just a Missouri issue. This is a worldwide issue. So thank you so much for your time, for your heart, and just for your compassion for this community, Brendan.
No, thank you for having these conversations so people can be aware. I mean, awareness is the first step in any program. So
yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching this and you need help, do not be afraid to reach out for help. Call a friend, call a family member, reach out to your pastor. If you have a counselor or a teacher that you trust, we want you to find the help that you need. So God bless you, and we hope this video was a blessing to you.